This is not, after all, the first time that a government has come in with a plan to get Britain building and has tried to use the central power of the state to deliver that.
I think Labour's entering office on planning reform is different to anything we've experienced in the past because they have a very clear mandate to reform the planning system. Actually, a Labour councillor for Westminster told me on Twitter that they were trying to build some council houses in Westminster and they had to fill out a 170-page equality impact assessment.
Hello and welcome to the Institute of Economic Affairs podcast with me, Tom Clougherty, my co-host, Matthew Lesh, and joining us on the podcast this week, Sam Dumitriu, the head of policy at Britain Remade. Sam writes a fantastic Substack called Notes on Growth. He was previously research director at the Entrepreneurs Network, and indeed, like me and Matthew, he was once head of research at the Adam Smith Institute. Nice to have us all together. We're talking today, and I think Sam is the perfect person for this, about housing, infrastructure, and economic growth. Matthew, why don't you tee up the housing topic for us?
Sure. First of all, I have to think, what do you call a triplet of former heads of research? So there must be a special name for us. Of course, this week I thought was actually quite a fascinating start to the Labour government. We saw Rachel Reeves stand up on Monday and declare a plan for growth, which I think we'll discuss a bit more shortly, but also make, I think, quite significant announcements on the housing front. Now, admittedly, many of these came from the manifesto, but the fact that they're day one priorities, I think, says quite a lot, including restoring mandatory housing targets, introducing a task force to speed up several specific sites, 300 more planning officers, and the Secretary of State writing to planning authorities to require coverage of local plans and reviews of Greenbelt. Sam, I'm wondering what you made of the speech when it came to housing.
So I see it as a very, very good start. So it's great that we're in the correct direction. We're talking about how the planning system is, the biggest drag on economic growth we have, and it is the best lever we have for speeding up economic growth. I think some of the measures announced are good. I particularly like the fact that they're going to use the call-in powers, the ability of the Secretary of State to essentially say that, look, this council has decided a planning application, but they've decided it in a completely wrong way, and I've decided to say yes instead, and that they're going to use them much more aggressively and recover the two big data centre projects, two projects where on Greenbelt land, but not particularly desirable Greenbelt land, we're talking quarries and landfill sites and things like that. These massive investments have been blocked. So that was very good to hear that they're going to kind of use that as a tool for promoting economic growth. Restoration of housing targets, I think. So I would say that housing targets are necessary to make a bad system, which is our planning system, work well. When we got rid of them in response, or we relaxed them greatly in response to the Villiers and Seeley amendments, both of whom lost their seat in the last election, that led to a big drop-off in the number of new homes being built. Now, my fundamental takeaway from what Reeves has talked about so far is that they are doing good things, but they are maybe less so on the Greybuilt issue, but relying heavily on the power of the centre and the sort of top-down force, putting pressure on local authorities. Now, Labour have been elected with a massive landslide majority. They are riding high at the moment. It's not hard to use the centre when you're riding high. My concern is what happens when you lose the Chesham and Amersham by-election style incidents, right? By-elections, we know, can lead to very, very big shifts in policy. Will Labour hold their nerve, and will they be able to... It's very easy to say yes to a Conservative NIMBY, to a project blocked by a Conservative NIMBY council. Will they say the same to a Labour NIMBY council? Because there are lots of Labour NIMBY councils out there.
I mean, I suppose to pick up on that, this is not, after all, the first time that a government has come in with a plan to get Britain building and has tried to use the central power of the state to deliver that. Now, I mean, on the one hand, I find it deeply irritating when I see Conservatives already coming out and saying, oh, well, this is classic Labour, top-down central planning, this is not a market approach. You think, okay, fine. It isn't. But when you got rid of those targets, everything just, ground to a halt. We're not comparing a market driven by local incentives with a top-down system. It's sort of a mix of both at any given time. So I think there are two things here. One is, yes, there is that possibility that, like other governments, you come in with lots of energy, you try and do everything from the centre, you run into opposition, and slowly it peters out and you focus on other things which are maybe less controversial or more popular. So curious to know, are Labour prepared for that possibility? Have they got plans to try and get around it? But the second thing is, maybe this is a first step. And if you want to make quick changes, this is the kind of approach you need to take. But to make kind of faster rates of building, whether it's housing, whether it's anything else, sustainable in the long term and kind of self-generating, so you don't need a constant push from Whitehall, what can you do? What changes can you make to give us a healthier development system in the UK?
So I think Labour's entering office on planning reform is different to anything we've experienced in the past because they have a very clear mandate to reform the planning system. It's very rare a government picks that fight in advance and develops a mandate for themselves to do something like that. There are cases of politicians picking a fight and trying to get an electoral mandate to do things and not doing very well. I think you can think of Ted Heath and Who Runs Britain.
Right.
So it's very rare that you both have an election and have that power. So I think they have more leeway here than any other government has in the past. But reality will that political reality of incentives will still exist. Now, I think what I've seen so far is that there isn't a clear plan for how you make local communities more supportive of development, or a plan, I think, beyond Greenbelt and building out, which typically involves building in places controlled by Liberal Democrats and Conservative MPs. Labour have a lot more Greenbelt seats than they previously had, but in the most desirable locations for Greenbelt building, London, South East, York, I think, as well. They've got York Outer, but then the places just outside of York beyond that are all sort of Lib Dem or Tory still. There is still that ability to say we can impose housing on people who probably won't vote for us. And given that we're at a very high point in the electoral cycle for Labour, probably never will vote for you in the next election. So I think that is perhaps one thing that might be politically durable for Labour. But what they need to be thinking about is, what are those bottom-up tools? The top-down is very important if you don't fix the system. But how do you drive that? And I think one thing is the idea of community land auctions. The idea essentially where you can get lots of different people to different landowners, perhaps on the Greenbelt, to say, I will submit my land at this cost, and then you can grant planning permission on it. And then whoever's got the best offers, you bundle them all up and you buy them at that price. And then you sell it on to developers with the planning permission already granted. Potentially that can unlock a lot of money that's currently solely going to landowners on quite a random and speculative basis, and instead capture some of that for the community. And given that local authorities are pretty stretched in terms of their finances, probably quite a strong incentive to say yes. That's one example, but I think it's also worth trying to, I would say, if Labour want to be more centralising, they should think about taking some of the decisions at the top level at a much greater level of specificity. So Labour's talk in their manifesto about, and their report, Power and Partnership, which is kind of an even more in-depth economic manifesto they did before the manifesto. And what that says is essentially, we will say whether or not you build houses is a decision for the centre. How you build them is a decision for the local authority. The problem is figuring out how you can make that process go as slow as you want. You can come up with all sorts of ways where we've said how and actually it's not really, and it actually impinges upon if, because we've imposed all sorts of silly requirements and bureaucracy, etc. Now, one thing they could do, for instance, is take a bit more of a bold approach, perhaps the approach taken by the Jacinda Ardern's government in New Zealand, where they essentially said around train stations, you can build up to this density, and that's no longer a decision for the local authority except in exceptional cases.
Right.
That would be the sort of thing that I think would move the dial. And I think actually is the sort of thing Labour should get behind. Not just because it's great, it's a way of getting more homes built, but because if you take climate change seriously, you want more people to live near fast public transport connections and not live in a field somewhere where with a few other houses where everyone else has to drive to work and you have to drive to the shops, etc., etc.
Yeah.
So I think there is a very compelling case for doing something like that, and I hope they move in that direction.
I think it's probably worth and the fascinating conversation in the weeds, but just stepping back from a moment and kind of, I suppose, smelling the roses about just how extraordinary this is, that on the Monday after an election, a chancellor, not even the housing secretary, but the chancellor themselves has gotten up and made planning reform and housing the absolutely centre of their growth agenda. I don't think that is ever happy for. And you add on top of that the fact that it's a Labour government doing it. This seems to be something that we should really, I suppose, applaud as a premise and say that this is, as you've said, a massive opportunity, a massive mandate to get things done. And I think there are several reasons. The fact that it's coming from the Chancellor kind of gives it a lot more power within the Whitehall system, which is really important to note, and the fact that they've got such a big mandate to do it. Now, I think that you're absolutely right, Sam, Tom, the details aren't there yet in terms of what we're going to achieve. We had housing targets up until 3 years ago. That didn't solve it's better than not having them for the reasons we've discussed, but that by itself won't fix it. So all these kind of things, particularly around urban densification, are what's going to enable the system to be solved. I suppose, Sam, pushing back a little bit, I suppose, dealing with what we've been seeing on social media, I think there's effectively two attacks on this that are coming out to the fore that I really want to deal with. The first one is, particularly, I think you find this more on the left, although sometimes you find it from Tories as well. It's not really about planning. That's not the problem here. What we have is too much central bank financing. We have too much land banking. The private sector will never build enough housing. We hear this a lot, that even building more housing won't fix the problem, or even liberalising the planning system won't fix the problem, just because the private sector just can't do this. They can't fix this problem. What we need is a lot more social housing, a lot more state direction involved.
So, yeah, I mean, I guess we can break them apart in two, so that obviously housing, not the only factor in determining the price of a home, and the price of a home can be how much it costs to own, but also how much it costs to access the services that a home provides, i.e. rent and property. That isn't just affected by the number of homes there is, it's affected by the demand for the homes. And because housing is a long-lived asset, interest rates will be a factor. Now, we've seen interest rates go up by a lot, but we haven't seen house prices drop by a huge amount. They've dropped by a bit, and they are much more volatile than they otherwise would be because they're so high up in the scale already. But fundamentally, it comes down to those supply factors in terms of how much housing will cost. Now, I think the interesting point is some people say they're pro-supply, but they're sceptical of the private sector to deliver that supply. So they say social housing is what's needed. Now, I would say that typically what this is a limited historical view, right? If your chart only goes back 70 years, it definitely looks as if social housing is essential to meeting demand. And actually, that's typically in raw numbers. We were obviously demolishing a lot of homes at the same time in that period, but it does look like that. Now, if you go back even further and you look at what Britain was like before we essentially nationalised the right to develop your property, probably the biggest nationalisation of Clement Manley and the one that, bizarrely, the Conservatives seem to love the most. And you actually see under a system where we had what you'd call bright line rules, you'd say you could build up to this density in this area, provided the street was this wide. If a street was narrower, you couldn't build as high. If you wanted to add an extra story, something to do with the right angle of the roof, so that people's rights to life, essentially a system that tries to address all of those typical concerns that you might have about overlooking and something, and in a very specific way, and then otherwise leaves it up to the market and expects actually areas over time as demand shifts to become more developed. We moved away from that system, but when we had that system, the private sector was building many more houses than was built in the Town and Country Planning Act era. And actually, if you adjust for population, it's actually the one era where we really were building enough homes for what we really need to do now. And I think people talk about 300,000 as the target today. That's average over this Parliament, but let's be clear, we're starting from quite a low level. We're probably not going to hit 300,000 until year 3 at least,
right?
Because the planning permissions aren't granted in a few months. I'd love it if they were, but they aren't. So actually, we need to be looking at something like probably close to 400,000 or more homes a year in the final years of the Parliament.
And actually, that 300 target comes from Kate Barker's report for the last Labour government, right? So under Tony Blair or Gordon Brown, we needed 300,000 homes a year from about 20 years ago, let's say. And we didn't do that, so presumably there's a big backlog of homes that should have been built to meet demand and haven't been. So yeah, there's certainly a lot of progress that needs to be made there for sure. One question I have about Labour's approach is the extent to which they've internalised I suppose the extent to which it is true to think of them as planners, and it's allocating homes here, allocating homes there, and so on, rather than thinking we need to build where demand is highest, and we can tell where demand is highest because it's where the prices have gone up the most. Most of what we've talked about so far is kind of greenfield development. Now, greenfield development is essential. And you want to be extending towns and everything, but you also want to be densifying, you also want to be building up. Mm-hmm. I just worry a little bit with the emphasis that the new government puts on new towns as part of their agenda. Now, if we're talking Edinburgh new town, that's one thing. If you're talking, disconnected new town in the middle of nowhere, where it makes political sense to build but no economic sense, that's kind of worrying. Do you have a sense of this?
So my view is that new towns will not be delivering a serious amount of homes over this Parliament. I think the sort of scale of investment you need to get a new town functioning is not a 5-year thing, it's a 10, 15-year thing. Now, I would say that while I think, Edinburgh new town urban extensions is the right approach to new towns, there are probably spots around the country where there are good transport links and there is a village that could be expanded. I don't think that's absurd to think that there aren't good locations to build homes in this era. Probably, where East-West Rail intersects with some other railways.
Right.
That's probably the sweet spot. And where a small improvement in capacity on the railways can potentially unlock a fast connection to London or to Oxford or Cambridge. I think there are cases where that could be done. These are complicated projects. They take a long time. If you want to take a dent into the housing crisis, you need to move much faster, and you need to have, your traditional means of building, and you need to actually get densification to really happen seriously.
Yeah.
And at the moment, densification it happens in kind of piecemeal ways. And it's typically quite an unpopular way of doing it, I think, because you end up with a situation where you'll have loads of 2-story houses, and then we finally found a site, so we'll build a 20-story. It would probably be better if you had rows of 8 stories, and that's missing middle, medium density. That would be nice, but that's, our current system doesn't lend itself to that. So I think we need to really have scrutiny. And I think you're right in that Labour are still planners at heart. They talk about the need for reform, but I suspect at the moment, this might not be true with the Treasury team as much, but essentially it's, if we do planning better and we do it in a much more pro-development way, we will solve the problem. I would say that we need to go beyond that.
Yeah. All right, well, speaking of lengthy and complicated projects, I suspect we could talk about housing for a long time, but let's shift to infrastructure. Yeah. You and Britain Remade more generally have done some really interesting work on infrastructure, shining a light on how much more it costs to build I mean, practically all kinds of infrastructure. I think you've done trains and trams and nuclear power stations, maybe roads or bridges as well. But also but why? Why it takes so long, why it's so expensive. And I don't know if it was you or maybe it was one of your colleagues or someone else on social media, but coined this expression, consultation nation. Why don't you just give us the top line of why we're so bad at building infrastructure in this country, and maybe also how is that holding us back economically?
Right. Let's do some examples. So the Lower Thames crossing. So this is a road. It would connect Essex and Kent. It would relieve pressure on the Dartford crossing, one of the most congested roads, but also one of the most important roads economically to the UK. Its planning application alone is 359,000 pages long. The National Highways, which is an arm of government, it's an arm's length body, but it is an arm of government, has spent £297 million solely, so they spent more money than this overall, but £297 million solely on the development consent order. That is the planning application. So we have one part of government that have been basically told to do something, asking another arm of government, and in that process, millions upon millions have been spent. In fact, more money has been spent than the cost of building the Leerdale Tunnel, which is the world's longest road tunnel. In fact, twice as much. Now, Norwegians, where the Leerdale Tunnel is, have favourable rock for tunnelling. So they can tunnel cheaper than us. And I think even if we become absolutely brilliant geniuses at tunnelling, we'll probably always have a cost disadvantage against the Norwegians because we don't have the luxury of very, very hard rock, which won't leak water when you throw some dynamite on it or now use a tunnel boring machine. But we're not comparing Norwegian tunnelling with British tunnelling. We are comparing Norwegian tunnelling with British applying for planning permission. So I think that the planning system is clearly a factor, both the cost, but it's not just the cost, it's also how the cost navigating the planning system leads to design changes that increase cost. So there is a study in the US that finds that since about the 70s, where you've had this kind of explosion where post Watergate, people became a lot more sceptical of government, and not necessarily in some ways in free market ways, but in other ways, they became very interested in making it easier for citizens to sue the government and access rights that way, and influence policy via things like citizen review, and to be consulted on things. And what did this mean? Well, over time, roads in the US became wigglier. The official term is tortuosity. Try saying that 3 times fast. And what this study looking at this found was that as roads became wigglier, that led to a cost increase. So for each percent of wiggliness, you end up spending a lot more money. And, wiggliness can be, driving around a city and avoiding some, perhaps the most efficient route, but perhaps a route that might upset some residents. But it can also mean, green bridges over roads, cutting down into the ground and tunnelling instead of building a road above ground. And you see this in things like HS2, where a very large segment of HS2 is tunnelled. I think if you're going from London to Birmingham, you only get about 8 minutes of proper daylight. The rest is either in a cutting or a tunnel. Wow. And that is to deal with objections. It's cheaper to build above ground, typically. It's cheaper, like tunnelling. If you can avoid tunnelling, you should. And that increases costs. And we see that also with pylons, which are going to be really essential to the UK economy going forward, because we've got a much more decentralised energy system. We're no longer in the era where there's a few gas and a few coal power stations around the country in very predictable locations. Now we have demand springing up here or there based on the weather, based on where batteries are, etc. And that means we need more pylons. Lots of people want those pylons to be buried, but that comes at a cost. They deny this, but they are wrong to deny this. Let's be clear, they are wrong to deny this. It is much cheaper to build a pylon that goes above ground than it is to tunnel. not least because when you want to fix a pylon, you just send someone up a ladder rather than digging down and figuring it out underground. So these sort of changes all add costs. And I think sometimes you have a political problem, right, where the people who object to things have a very clear and strong voice in the system, and their voice is heard. But the problem is the people who want cheaper bills but don't necessarily make the connection are ignored. And I actually think they aren't ignored forever. I think what we've seen is the Conservatives punished primarily for economic mismanagement. I think above everything, even when you say, well, public service is not working, but that is linked to economic mismanagement. It's linked to there not being enough money to invest in the public services. Money solves lots of problems, even if you have an inefficient model in all other ways. Like if you throw enough money at a problem, you can usually solve it. The fact there's less money eventually bites you in the backside and leads you to being turfed out of office. The problem is very hard for politicians to keep their eyes on the long-term prize. Labour coming into office and basically talking about growth and tying everything to growth is really good. We need to make sure that they do that for the whole of the parliament, that they don't then get bogged down. And similarly, when we talk about Conservatives in opposition, it's very important that they don't just go for the sugar high of objecting to a planning application.
Yeah.
It's key that they actually say, well, this is our strategy for building. We might have a slightly different strategy to Labour, but we are going to still support development in broad terms. We are not going to just be the NIMBY party, because that's not a platform for governing over 5 years. It might be a platform for winning a by-election or running a council for a couple of years.
The Tories have been the NIMBY party, and we can't exactly say it's been a huge success. I'm wondering if we can just grab your thoughts on what Labour has announced, because I think they have, and in fact, I think the Tories to some extent as well in their manifesto accepted your analysis of the problem, and they talked about removing red tape for major projects. They're ending the de facto ban on onshore wind, and you've already said they're going to be using ministerial powers a bit more in a pro-development way. Is there much meat on the bone there? Because it all sounds good, but so, do we know what it's actually going to do?
I mean, the onshore wind, it's a great example of how much damage a single footnote can do, right? So since the war in Ukraine started, since Putin invaded, Ukraine has managed to build more onshore wind farms than the UK. In fact, they've added 12 times the capacity of England.
Right.
And that is mad, right? That is really mad, given that we are actually a very windy place. And, there's all these sorts of people wanting it. So that, I think, will make a difference, and you'll start to see that impact quite soon. Now, part of the problem is you look at these big projects and they have very, very long planning applications, and they have these very, very, very long environmental impact assessments and all this red tape. And part of that is to navigate the risk of being sued in court. And part of that issue is that over time, so when Labour set the planning system we have for infrastructure up in 2008, the idea was that Parliament would set these things called national policy statements, and we would say, this is our policy on wind, this is our policy on energy, this is our policy on roads. And as a result, that would give very, very strong weighting to that policy in planning discussions for major infrastructure projects. The issue is, the idea was they're meant to be updated every 5 years. They weren't updated since 2012 until the last few months of the government.
Right.
And they're probably going to be updated again to be slightly more pro-development, I suspect. Because they went out of date, but legislation kept whirring on, people could quite plausibly challenge it. So, well, yeah, you have a roads policy in 2012, but then you passed a net zero policy in 2019, you passed an environmental policy in 2020, and so on and so forth. And all of a sudden, you have to navigate that legal avenue where people could quite plausibly see, well, yeah, it's in line with the national policy statement, but is it in line with XYZ law going forward? So updating those statements will have an impact on that bureaucracy, where I think probably the Conservatives may be more naturally on good territory and Labour might be on a slightly weaker ground, is about the other aspects of judicial review. So, fixing the way we do consultations so that you don't have to consult as much, and it's not so easy to sue on consultations will help. And I don't think Labour will be opposed to that. Fixing, the sort of uncertainty in the legal system around, when the national policy statement is in or out of date. I think Labour are fine to deal with that. Where I suspect we've got a government run by a human rights lawyer who basically made his name taking government to court and challenging laws and using court cases as a strategy for changing, not just solving one injustice, but trying to change the law overall. You have quite a few other people in government now who have similar backgrounds. The Solicitor General, the Attorney General, similar, same legal chambers there. So there are, I think, kind of more of a view that, actually suing is a perfectly reasonable means of getting your way, and that's actually something we are very nervous about tampering with, is what my instinct would be.
Interesting.
So the problem is people can use legal challenges to delay projects even when they don't have a high chance of success. So I'll give you an example. So there's a road between Black Cat and Caxton Gibbet, two roundabouts between Cambridge and Milton Keynes. Extremely high levels of local support for it. Extremely, it's been backed by the MPs. There's money for it. It's been in the government's road investment strategy. It passed through planning. They were ready to start work. And then it got taken to court on the grounds that they hadn't assessed the carbon impact properly. And then that led to a delay. Now, ultimately, because the road investment strategy itself had its carbon impact assessed and the person who was suing them lost that case, we knew they weren't very likely to win this case, but they still were able to sue, and that still added a lengthy delay. And this is the case with a lot of things, we sign up to these treaties and they're relatively benign initially, but then case law develops and all of a sudden we've committed ourselves to things we didn't quite expect. So the person suing for that road project had their legal costs capped. So not the cost of preparing their arguments and everything, that was unlimited. But usually when you sue someone on grounds that turned out to be baseless, you have to pay their legal costs. That's not the case if you're suing on environmental grounds. So, in fact, their costs were capped, I think, at 5,000, but perhaps 10,000 if it counted as an NGO or campaign group. And that is something that creates a huge incentive for people to say, look, if I delay a project via a legal challenge, there's a good chance it'll get cancelled at some point, or there's a good chance it'll have a chilling effect on other infrastructure.
So this is why, you've written about this. There's this general sense that, the reason we have low productivity, the reason we're not growing is because we don't invest enough. So we just need to find some more money to invest, unlock some capital from somewhere is always the phrase that's used, right? But you've said, well, yeah, there are good ways of doing that, but the problem is we're creating massive uncertainty around projects which would contribute to economic growth and which would raise productivity. It sounds like this actually is a huge and multifaceted problem. So, we've talked a lot about NIMBYism. That's still there. There's widespread bureaucratic discretion. The rules are not clear in advance. It's hard to know whether your project is going to be approved or not. Even if it is, even if you've jumped through all the hoops and you've done all the consultations, you risk legal challenge. And then we also have this big kind of bureaucratic NGO blob, which is kind of sucking on all of this stuff. They're kind of, in a way, they're extracting their own rents, right, from this horrible bureaucratic mess that we've created. And this isn't just about housing. It's not just about infrastructure. Presumably, this is a big economy-wide challenge. And in some sense, this, it seems to me, is at the heart of our growth problem. Would you kind of share that assessment? Do you think this is a generalizable principle that we need to take on, this sort of bureaucratic state, if you want to call it that, if we want to get the economy growing again?
So I think, that there is a clear problem with the planning system in that it enables people to prevent investment that is desirable and should happen. I think the problem with Britain isn't that we are uniquely jammed today. The problem is that we don't have the opportunity to get the jam tomorrow because it's blocked by the planning system. And as a result, we are in a much, much trickier situation with investment. And I think there are, you can talk about like people sort of scheming against you and trying to make things as hard as possible. But fundamentally, as we've seen within just the first week of this new government, you can change the law. It is possible. You can delete that footnote, right? You can change things. And all of a sudden, there are much fewer grounds for people to extract those rents, to destroy that value. And I think that's what we need to do. And hopefully we've got an opportunity now with a government with a strong majority who want to get things built and have a mandate to do that, to actually start taking on some of these problems. I suspect they'll find problems they didn't quite expect. I'll give you an example of sort of things that are coming up that I didn't even really know about, but actually a Labour councillor, I think for Westminster, told me on Twitter that they were trying to build some council houses in Westminster, and they had to fill out a 170-page equality impact assessment. And, they're supportive of the idea of equality impact assessments, but then they're starting to realise that actually this is
mad.
Affecting the ability of the state to deliver on things it's promised. And on the Lower Thames crossing, I was reading, I think in Politico, David Blunkett was making the argument that this case of the Lower Thames crossing isn't just a problem for the economy, but fundamentally undermines trust in politics. If politicians can't promise an infrastructure project and then actually deliver that infrastructure project in a speedy manner, people then start saying, well, I don't trust the ability of politicians to deliver anything, so I will turn to whoever shouts loudest or whoever reflects my values, whether they're, on the populist right or the populist left.
Yeah.
And that's not a good situation.
I mean, that's something I see. If you make government fundamentally impossible, if it cannot respond to democratic impulses, people demand the strong man to come and clear things up and get things done. And that could be a pretty dangerous place to be, especially if you share our kind of liberal values.
I mean, I think on this water point about achieving economic growth, it was quite fascinating. There were two other parts to Reeve's speech. The third one was reform. The first one was stability, which I think is a bit more of a political attack on the Tories and the chaos of that era. Well, there is something there, though, of course, about responsible public finances that she rejected, a big tax and spend agenda. That was all good and fine. What I thought, though, that the second one, though, was all about investment. That's the government's other big announcement this week, which is the National Wealth Fund. This is this idea that the government's going to come in, inject $7 billion more into certain projects of the future. I know they're talking about things like green hydrogen, for example. I'm massively skeptical about that for several reasons. One, the Tories have been doing this for several years. It's not actually new that the government comes in and spends a few £1 billion here or there in the hope that it's going to boost investment. It's not clear to me that that is what is necessary to boost investment. But then it gets back to the point you've both been making there, which is even if you want that, it's not necessarily that there is a lack of finance available in the UK. The UK has a financial global capital, second only to the US. It's that there is a lack of good opportunities to invest in the UK, because if you want to do green hydrogen in the UK, you can't get permission from anyone to do anything in the physical place. And that's what needs to be solved, rather than thinking £7 billion, which in the scheme of things is not actually a lot of money when it comes to investment. And it's also probably not a good idea for the government to be deciding which investments to do is going to solve the problem.
I think that's right. I think it is about the investment opportunities. Now, I think there are some broader interesting questions about investment under Labour that should be addressed. I hate the term wealth fund because it's fundamentally, we are not in a situation, we are not wealth. We don't have the wealth.
They're borrowing money to do it, yeah.
Or we're taxing.
It's not Norway.
We don't have a natural resource where the rents are such that we prefer to distribute them over time and not cause some sort of currency appreciation that's all concerning in the very short term, right? There are specific reasons to have sovereign wealth funds that this doesn't meet the criteria of, and actually you probably wouldn't be making these type of investments with a sovereign wealth fund. You'd probably be much drier and boringer and like a pension fund, essentially. Now, there is an interesting question about how Labour gets investment up, because there are lots of things that need investment, but there are very, very, very tight public finances. So, our road network still needs investment. There's very, very poor east-west connections in many parts of the country. And if you talk to manufacturers, this is one of their number one concerns. People can't get to work. You can't get your freight from one factory to another. And do you need those investments? Now, can we turn to the private sector to build roads, to operate them, and then to transfer them over in the long run, perhaps by tolling it as a concession or for some form of shadow tolling? France does it. Most European countries do it to a much greater degree than us. Why can't we? And I think part of the issue is that, and I think actually the Conservatives fell backwards on this agenda, is that we were trying to do private finance for things that were very, very complicated, and government typically isn't the most sophisticated negotiator. If you're a good negotiator of contracts, you typically don't work for the government because you can earn a lot of money in the private sector. And, lots of people work for government and happily take a pay cut, but typically they're not the people who like to do contract negotiations. They're typically the people who are the most hard-nosed, sort of tough, willing to really have a real proper battle with people. It's the people who want to do nice things and be teachers, help people in the health system and so on and so forth, that are willing to take those pay cuts. So you end up in those, when you're dealing with very, very complex contracts that are hard to monitor, you end up with pretty bad deals, and you end up having, and even in the case of some roads, right, you can tell the roads that were done under a certain PFI scheme by just how neatly cut the grass by the road is. Some roads have very overgrown roadsides, others are perfectly manicured, and we probably paid way too much to cut that grass. But on simpler projects, we can, like private finance, and with, schemes like CFDs for energy, that's one way of doing private finance. The new sewer for London, that was built via private finance. And I think we need to look at the models that work here. And, it might be a little bit of subsidy to get you over the line, but that's still better than the government taking on the whole project. And part of the problem, part of the reason to invest with the private sector is not just that they do demand a higher return, but that higher return is partly because they are trying to adjust for the fact that there is risk in projects, and this project selection itself should improve as a result. Fewer infrastructure projects that will never pay off will get built via private finance, I suspect.
All right, well, that's a big topic in itself, and you hit on one of my favourites there, road pricing, or road tolling at least. Maybe we'll have you back to talk about some of those issues a little bit further. Sam, thank you. Fascinating discussion, a great deal of complexity in all of these issues, but it's good to see that there are answers, and maybe there's some hope of progress as well. As I mentioned earlier, if you like what you've heard Sam saying on this podcast, I recommend you follow him on Substack with his notes on growth. You should also follow the IEA on Substack at insider.iea.org.uk. And as ever, you can find more on many of these topics and everything else at iea.org.uk. Until next time, thank you very much.